What if a simple flight home became a battle for dignity at 30,000 feet? Imagine boarding an ordinary plane, hoping only to reach the people you love, only to find yourself targeted, humiliated, and pushed to the edge by the very crew sworn to keep you safe. For Dr. Simone Avery, a powerful yet quietly empathetic woman, a trip to see her ailing father turns into a test of every value she holds dear. Why do the rules seem to change for some passengers, but not for others? How much silence is enough before you finally speak out? And what happens when the person they try to silence is the one with the power to transform an entire industry? In a world where small moments of injustice often pass unseen, what would you do if the spotlight suddenly turned on you? As Simone's story unfolds, every choice, every confrontation, and every silent witness raises one burning question. Can a single voice still change the sky for everyone? If you're ready for a story that will shake your heart, challenge your mind, and make you see air travel in a whole new light, hit like, share this journey with someone who needs it, and subscribe now. Let's begin. The airport was a living, breathing organism, one that seemed to pulse with stress and longing. It was not quite dawn at Summit City International, but the halls were already crowded. The air a confusing mix of burnt coffee and jet fuel, voices weaving in and out of the constant announcements. Dr. Simone Avery paused just inside the automatic doors, adjusting her simple black tote on her shoulder and pulling her government-issue carry-on close. There was a chill in the air, not just from the AC, but something emotional too, as if the building itself could sense her heavy heart. Simone's life was full of airports. She was used to these in-between spaces, the lines, the stares, the peculiar way everyone's patience seemed thinner at 5:45 But this morning was different. She was not flying for a conference or a board meeting. She was going home to Oak Ridge, a place she only called home now because her father was there, fighting a stubborn illness that had reduced a once vibrant man to someone barely recognizable in hospital blues. She dressed simply, comfortable gray slacks, a pale blue cotton blouse, soft-soled flats, no jewelry except for a slim watch and her late mother's wedding band, worn on a chain around her neck. Her ID, clipped inside her tote, revealed nothing of her position, and she preferred it that way. Outside the job, she wanted to be just another face in the crowd, invisible, safe. The check-in line snaked through the concourse, snappish and restless. Simone drifted into place, eyes on her phone, answering a late-night text from her sister Rachel. "Text me when you board. Dad's awake. He keeps asking for you." Simone's fingers hovered over the reply. Her father's voice rang in her mind, stubborn and wise. "Don't let them see you sweat, baby girl. The world already wants you to be angry." She forced a gentle smile. Typing, "On my way. Rach, see you soon." The security line moved slowly. Simone kept her head down, thinking about the flight ahead and the weekend to come. She found herself cataloging the small rituals the nervous family of 5 with color-coded bags, the business traveler barking into his phone, the old woman clutching a plastic shopping bag. At every checkpoint, Simone watched as glances bounced off her dark skin, sometimes curious, sometimes blank, sometimes uneasy. It was a subtle thing, the way people shifted around her, barely visible, but always there, especially when she traveled alone. She passed through security, pulling her laptop and shoes into the bins, moving with practiced efficiency. The TSA agent barely looked up. She was used to that too. When she emerged on the other side, she felt her muscles loosen slightly, as if surviving security was an accomplishment. It was always one more test she had passed. Gate B-12 for Skyline Air Flight 7146 to Oak Ridge was already buzzing with low-grade tension. Passengers packed the benches and stood in clusters near the counter, jockeying for position. Over the din, the boarding agent's voice crackled over the speaker. Simone caught the name Owen Price. She watched as he processed passengers with robotic precision, his jaw tight, his manner clipped. Simone found a seat near the windows. The sky outside was a deep blue, streaked with the gold of early morning. She watched the planes trundle across the tarmac, thinking of her father's stories about riding the rails in his youth, chasing opportunity across the country. There was something deeply American about traveling in hope. She thought moving, always moving, for love or work or the simple desire to be somewhere else. Her phone vibrated. Rachel again. "He's asking what you want for breakfast. Says you always had a sweet tooth." A pang of tenderness and grief hit Simone's chest. She typed back, "Tell him I want pancakes, with strawberries, like always." As boarding time neared, Simone began to notice the subtle rhythms of the gate area. A young black man and his wife waited anxiously as Owen Price scrutinized their documents, speaking slowly as if explaining something to children. Just behind them, a white man in a designer suit breezed by, offering only a nod and a boarding pass. Owen waved him through without a glance at his bag, which was easily twice the size of the standard carry-on. Simone felt the first sting of recognition, the sense that rules were being enforced unevenly, that some people were already marked as problems before even stepping on the plane. She pressed her lips together, remembering her father's words again. "Keep your composure. They're always watching." When her group was finally called, Simone waited for the rush to subside before approaching the counter. Owen Price barely glanced at her. He scanned her boarding pass, then frowned, his eyes flicking from her face to her carry-on. "Can you put your bag in the sizer for me, ma'am?" he said, tone flat. Simone blinked. "It's standard size. I've used it on every flight. We're at full capacity today. Policy says I need to check." Simone glanced at the sizer, the battered metal frame beside the counter. It was empty. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, the silent calculation, the question of whether she would make a scene. She could have argued, pointed to the man with the oversized roller bag, but she just smiled softly, lifted her bag, and slid it easily into the sizer. It slipped in with room to spare. Owen gave a curt nod, not meeting her gaze. "Fine. You're good to go." Simone retrieved her bag, swallowing the familiar cocktail of frustration and resignation. She didn't like the way these moments made her feel small, invisible, or worse, hypervisible. As she moved toward the jet bridge, she pulled out her phone and made a note in a private folder, "Gate Agent Owen Price, B-12. Asked to size bag after letting others through. Noted tone, no eye contact." It was a habit she'd developed over years in government service. Document everything. Protect yourself, even if you never need it. Stepping onto the jet bridge. Simone took a deep breath. The air was cooler, tinged with oil and metal, a familiar scent that always made her heart beat faster. She hoped the worst was over, but in the back of her mind, she knew sometimes the real turbulence only started once you left the ground. As the boarding line crept forward, Simone looked back one last time at the chaos of the gate area, Had Owen Price already challenging the next black passenger about their luggage? The script was old, she thought, but today, maybe, the ending would be different. Simone stepped out of the jet bridge and into the familiar crush of the plane's forward galley. The narrow passage smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee and lemon-scented sanitizer. The flight attendant stood at attention, plastering on smiles as they welcomed passengers. There was a rehearsed rhythm to their greetings, warm for some, clipped for others, all dependent on the energy of the morning. She found her seat, 10D, an aisle in Economy Plus. She had paid extra for a little more leg room, a small luxury for a woman used to sacrificing comfort for efficiency. The row was nearly empty, except for an elderly woman in 10C, reading a book with battered corners. Simone offered a gentle smile and received a quick, perceptive nod in return. She started to stow her carry-on in the overhead bin just above her seat. The bin was completely empty, except for a lone airline blanket folded at one end. Just as Simone lifted her bag, a voice snapped from behind. "Excuse me, ma'am, that compartment is reserved for crew equipment." Simone turned to face the speaker. The lead flight attendant was a tall woman in her early 40s, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes bright and unblinking. Her name badge read Fiona Miles. The crisp uniform fit perfectly, the kind that spoke of years of airline service and an authority that was not to be questioned. Simone blinked, her hand still on the handle of her bag. "Is there a sign?" she asked quietly. "I do not see any equipment in there." Fiona's smile was practiced but cold. "It is reserved for our use. You will need to find space further back. Regulations, ma'am." Passengers behind Simone were beginning to bunch up, waiting for her to move. She glanced at the elderly woman in 10C, who watched the interaction with quiet intensity. Simone pressed her lips together. She considered her options. She could argue. She could insist on her right to stow her bag above her seat as the rules permitted. She could reveal who she was, or she could comply, avoid making a scene, and keep moving. She let out a breath, set her bag in the next open compartment about 5 rows behind. The feeling was more than simple inconvenience. It was the knowledge that her belongings would now be out of sight, vulnerable. Still, she returned to her seat, smoothing her blouse and taking her phone from her tote. In a private note, she typed, "Flight 7146 attendant Fiona Miles. Denied overhead bin above assigned seat. No visible crew equipment. No sign. Polite, but unyielding." The cabin slowly filled, a shuffle of humanity squeezing into seats. The atmosphere grew dense. Simone watched the flight crew work the aisle, exchanging light jokes with certain passengers and briskly directing others. She noticed how warmly Fiona greeted a white couple in row 9, helping the woman fit her oversized purse into the overhead bin. She pressed her hands together in her lap, counting her breaths. She thought of her father, who would have smiled and told her to save her strength for battles that matter. But she also heard her mother's voice, softer but firmer, reminding her that small injustices left unchecked would become habits. A voice beside her drew Simone back to the present. The elderly woman in 10C looked over, eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. "First time on this route?" the woman asked quietly. Simone smiled. "Not quite. Visiting family in Oak Ridge." The woman nodded, her voice low enough to keep the conversation private. "Name's Lucille. If you need any help reaching your bag later, just ask me. Sometimes the staff can be particular." Simone chuckled softly, grateful for the offer. "Thank you, Lucille. That is very kind." She settled in as the safety demonstration began. Fiona's voice rang out over the PA, steady and confident. "Please pay close attention to the following important safety information." The demonstration felt familiar, even comforting. Simone watched passengers stare blankly at the flight attendant, gesturing with the yellow life vest. She thought again about the feeling of being watched, the pressure to be polite, composed, never given anyone a reason to label her as difficult. Moments before takeoff. The last passenger, a white man with an enormous roller bag, wrestled his luggage into the bin above 11A. No one stopped him. No one asked about policy. Fiona even offered to help with a smile. Simone glanced down at her phone, rereading her own notes, second-guessing herself. Was she imagining it? Was it just the stress she had spent years in rooms where her voice was the only black voice? She knew how easy it was for people to see her as the problem when she pushed back. She had trained herself to pick her battles, but the anger simmered quietly, unspent. As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied, the elderly woman leaned closer again. "Some rules seem to change depending on who is asking," she murmured, eyes fixed on her book. Simone smiled ruefully. She was grateful for the solidarity, even if it came in whispers. After takeoff, the cabin lights dimmed. The morning sun cut through the window shades, and Simone let her head rest against the seat. The drone of the engine lulled her into a restless half-sleep. She remembered her father's steady hands on the steering wheel, long ago, driving her and Rachel to the lake in the summers. She wondered if he would recognize her now, or if the illness had taken too much. When she opened her eyes again, the cart was rolling down the aisle. The flight attendants handed out drinks and snacks, asking every passenger for their choice. When Fiona arrived at row 10, her tone shifted. "Coffee," she said, eyes darting to Lucille, then resting coolly on Simone. "Black coffee, please, and some water, if you have it." Fiona handed over the coffee without a word. No napkin, no smile. A drop spilled onto Simone's hand. She flinched, more from surprise than pain. Fiona was already moving on. Lucille slid a napkin from her own tray toward Simone, giving her a look that said she had seen everything. "Thank you," Simone mouthed. Lucille offered a slight nod. Simone sipped the coffee. It was bitter and scalding. She forced herself to focus on the warmth, the ordinary sensation, letting it anchor her in the moment. She would not let herself be defined by the discomfort. Not today. She thought of her father, thought of Rachel, waiting in Oak Ridge with pancakes and strawberries. If only the world could be as simple as breakfast, she thought, but it never was. Outside, the clouds rolled by an endless, silent procession. Inside, the flight continued. But for Simone Avery, this trip home was already gathering the weight of something much bigger than a visit. The soft hum of the plane's engine became a familiar backdrop as Simone tried to settle into her seat. Her hands rested quietly on her lap, but her mind whirred with the tension of the morning. Already she was tallying the moments of discomfort as if keeping score in a private game she never asked to play. The boarding process dragged on. The aisles filled with people searching for seats and cramming oversized bags into already bulging overhead bins. Simone's gaze drifted from face to face. She watched parents with tired eyes shepherd children toward their row. She saw business travelers clutching laptops and college students nervously glancing at their boarding passes. The human swirl of a morning flight felt both ordinary and deeply vulnerable. Simone's attention snapped back as a new voice entered the cabin. Sophie Tran, the junior flight attendant, with neat black hair and a badge that seemed too large for her slight frame, Sophie smiled shyly at Simone before assisting an elderly man, struggling to lift his duffel above row 11. The man grunted, and Sophie quickly intervened, her hands gentle and reassuring. "Thank you, dear," he whispered. "You remind me of my granddaughter Sophie. Blushed pleased to be useful." She turned, catching Simone's eye. A brief connection flickered between them. One woman, recognizing another's quiet perseverance, Fiona Miles moved up and down the aisle, checking bags and making small talk. Her tone fluctuated between practiced warmth and cool command, depending on the passenger. She greeted a young couple in first class with honeyed politeness, even joking about their honeymoon trip. But when she reached the middle of the cabin, her words grew clipped and her patience thin. "Excuse me, sir. I'll need you to place your backpack fully under the seat in front of you." She snapped at a teenage boy Simone kept to herself, quietly observing. The disparities were unmistakable, but so routine that no one else seemed to notice. A few minutes later, as the last of the passengers settled in a new commotion started behind Simone. Two middle-aged women, one white, one Latina, were arguing over bin space for their oversized tote bags. Their voices rose sharp and anxious. Fiona swept in, intervening with brisk efficiency. "Let's keep the aisle clear. Ladies, we need to close the bins now," she declared. "I'll find a space for you." She hoisted the white woman's bag above row 9, sliding it in beside the couple's suitcases. With a smile, she reassured her, "Don't worry, it'll be right above you." When the Latina woman hesitated, Fiona's tone lost its gentleness. "I'll have to gate check your bag if you don't stow it now," she warned. The woman murmured something in Spanish voice, tight with embarrassment, and reluctantly complied. Simone watched this exchange with growing discomfort. Her own bag, stowed 5 rows back, thanks to Fiona's policy, felt like an accusation burning quietly in her mind. She could not help but wonder what would happen if she stood up and asked to move it now. But she hesitated. Was it worth the risk? The rules seemed to shift like sand beneath her feet, depending on who asked. The seat beside her remained empty for a moment before a young man slid in with a quick apology. His name was Daniel Brooks, and he introduced himself with a nervous handshake. "Sorry if I bump you on the way out," he joked. "I'm a chronic aisle tripper." Simone laughed quietly, glad to have company. Daniel smiled, relieved. The plane doors closed and Fiona's voice came over the speakers. "Welcome aboard Skyline Air Flight 7146 to Oak Ridge. Our flight time today is a short 1 hour and 40 minutes. We hope you enjoy the journey." As the safety demonstration played out, Simone leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She tried to breathe deeply, steadying herself. The morning's small humiliations replayed in her mind. Owen Price at the gate, the overhead bin confrontation, the careful surveillance of every move she made. It was all so subtle. Nothing she could point to as outright cruelty yet, all the more exhausting for its slipperiness. She wondered again whether she should have said something. Should she have called Fiona out for bending the rules? Should she have demanded to keep her bag nearby? A new wave of doubt crept in. Maybe she was reading too much into things. Maybe it really was just a full flight and Fiona was doing her job. But the looks, the little acts of kindness offered to others and withheld from her the way Sophie looked away, instead of stepping in, all of it added up. It always did. As the plane lifted off, Simone forced herself to look out the window. The sun was higher now, glancing off the wings with a blinding shimmer. The city below shrank into a patchwork of roads and buildings. Her heart ached with longing and weariness. She was going home, but she did not feel at home anywhere. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin lights brightened and the hum of conversation grew. Simone saw Fiona wheeling the drink cart forward. Sophie trailed behind, ready with cups and napkins. "What would you like to drink?" Fiona asked Lucille and TNC. Voice, pleasant, respectful. "Tea, please," Lucille replied. Fiona handed her a cup with care and a friendly word. "And for you, ma'am." Fiona turned to Simone, her voice suddenly devoid of warmth. "Just water," Simone said quietly. Fiona poured water into a plastic cup, handing it to Simone with a tight smile and no eye contact. Daniel, next to Simone, ordered ginger ale and received a napkin and a joke about airline snacks. Simone tried not to take it personally, but the pattern was so consistent it was impossible to ignore. She sipped her water silently, her thoughts racing with what she wanted to say, but never did. Lucille leaned toward her just a fraction. "You don't have to let them make you small," she whispered. "Sometimes the only way they stop is when someone tells them to." Simone met her gaze. A current of gratitude passed between them. She wondered if she could really be that person, if she wanted to be Fiona, and Sophie moved. On the cabin settled, Daniel pulled out a novel and began to read. Simone stared at her hands in her lap, caught in the tension between wanting to stay invisible and wanting to push back in the soft drone of the airplane in the middle of a sky that seemed both infinite and confining. Simone Avery waited. She did not know it yet, but the next few hours would test not only her patience, but her very understanding of justice and power. The game had only just begun. 30 minutes into the flight, the rhythms of the cabin became familiar. Simone tried to relax, but every muscle in her body remained quietly tense. She looked around and saw how other passengers had melted into comfort, reading, napping, tapping at phones. The world at 30,000 feet could feel oddly safe for some. For others like Simone, it felt like a microscope. Fiona Miles made her rounds with the snack basket. Lucille, in 10C, received a warm smile and a quietly offered granola bar. Daniel Brooks was given 2 bags of pretzels and a joke about the famous Skyline cookies. As Fiona approached Simone, her demeanor cooled instantly. Pretzels or cookies? Fiona asked Simone, was certain her request would be met with a flat yes or no. She smiled and reached for a bag of pretzels, but as she did, Fiona pulled the basket back just an inch. "Only 1 per passenger," she said crisply. Simone withdrew her hand, nodding. She accepted the lone bag and placed it on her tray. She watched as Fiona moved to the row behind, handing 2 cookies to a white teenager and her mother, who giggled and thanked her for being so generous. Simone looked down at her hands, anger simmering in her chest. It was never enough to ignore these moments, and yet it always seemed too much to call them out. The evidence was everywhere and nowhere. All at once, Lucille noticed Simone's tension and offered a subtle glance of sympathy. There was no need for words. Their silent understanding spoke volumes. As the snack service ended, Sophie Tran began collecting wrappers and cups. She paused at Simone's row and offered a shy smile before quickly moving on. Sophie's body language was a message in itself. Nervous, apologetic, uncertain how to help and afraid of doing the wrong thing, the plane dipped gently in mild turbulence. The seatbelt sign dinged and Fiona's voice floated through the speakers. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." She repeated the message in a softer tone for the first few rows, but when she walked down the aisle, her eyes lingered on Simone, just a bit too long. Simone felt every gaze, every gesture. Her pulse quickened. The line between paranoia and reality blurred when you lived with it every day. Was she imagining the scrutiny, or was it truly there? As she tried to distract herself with a magazine, Simone's thoughts drifted. She remembered being a child at school, the only black girl in the class, always careful to smile, to never challenge authority. Never let anyone think you were difficult. Her father's words returned again. "Stay calm, baby. Girl, you cannot fix the world in a day." She put the magazine aside and stared out the window. The clouds looked like distant mountains, pale gold and white with shadows rolling beneath them. She closed her eyes and listened to the soft click of Lucille's knitting needles and the faint murmur of passengers. She tried to breathe deeply in and out. The urge to speak up warred with her sense of caution. She imagined herself standing and confronting Fiona, demanding to know why she was treated differently. She pictured the faces of the other passengers, shocked, disapproving, or maybe some would silently cheer her on. How many had been through this? How many simply stayed silent? The moment passed. She stayed seated, hands in her lap, knuckles white. A small commotion a few rows back caught her attention. An older man, a white-haired professor by the look of him, was trying to open the overhead bin above row 14. His bag had shifted during takeoff and was wedged at an awkward angle. Fiona arrived briskly, and with a smile told him not to worry. She pulled down the bin, straightened his luggage, and closed it gently. No mention of rules or policies, just easy confidence. Simone's jaw tightened. She felt the frustration rising again. Her bag, 5 rows behind, still out of reach. This was not about space or rules. It was about power and who was allowed to feel at home. Daniel Brooks finished his book and looked over at Simone. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a long week? That's all." He seemed to understand. Daniel glanced at Lucille, then back at Simone. "People see more than you think," he said quietly. "And sometimes they're waiting for someone else to start." Simone turned his words over in her mind. The world was watching, but not everyone was looking for trouble. Some people were searching for permission to act, for justice to begin. The captain's voice broke through the cabin static. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are expecting some light turbulence as we approach the Midwest air. Corridor, please remain seated for the next 20 minutes. As the seatbelt sign blinked above her, Simone felt trapped literally and figuratively. She could not get her bag, she could not move. Her body was anchored, but her spirit roiled with possibility and doubt. Lucille leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you do decide to speak, I think you will do it with more grace than you know." Simone gave a grateful smile. That was what she needed, not more anger, but a reminder of her own power, not just as an official, but as a person. The next 20 minutes passed slowly. The plane trembled occasionally, but never enough to be dangerous. Sophie appeared again, walking quietly past each row, checking belts. She met Simone's eyes for a brief second, then looked away. A trace of guilt clouded her face. Simone's phone buzzed quietly. A message from Rachel. "We're making strawberry pancakes for when you get in. Dad is smiling for the first time in days." Simone let out a soft breath. She focused on the hope in that message. Let the world be harsh, she told herself. Let this flight be as cold as it wants. It would not take away the warmth of home. As the turbulence faded and the sun climbed higher, the mood of the cabin shifted back to normal. People chatted, laughed, dozed. Simone sat quietly, gathering her resolve. She did not know what the rest of the flight would bring, but she felt a change gathering inside her. A decision being made, not in anger, but in a stubborn determination to claim dignity for herself. She looked once more at the flight attendants, at the endless sky outside, and at Lucille, who gave a tiny nod of support. The game of faces was not over, but Simone Avery was ready to play her part. The sun had climbed higher, streaking the cabin with white gold. As the plane sailed above the cloud line, Simone glanced at her watch, wondering how much longer she could keep ignoring the knots in her chest. The minutes dragged, the weight of the morning pressed on her every nerve as the seatbelt sign flickered off and the gentle chime rang out. Simone felt a jolt of relief. She needed to retrieve her bag. She reached for the call button and waited. A few moments later, Sophie Tran appeared, her face cautious. "Excuse me, Sophie. I need my medication. It is in my carry-on bag about 5 rows behind." "Would you mind assisting me?" Simone asked her. Tone gentle, Sophie hesitated, glancing nervously toward the front galley. "I will check with the lead flight attendant," she whispered before hurrying away. Simone tried to remain calm, watching as Sophie approached Fiona Miles. The two exchanged quiet words. Fiona's eyes darted toward Simone, cold and appraising. Finally, Fiona strode down the aisle, her shoes tapping sharply on the carpet. "Ma'am, the seatbelt sign is off, but I cannot allow you to retrieve your bag right now," Fiona announced loud enough for neighboring passengers to hear. Simone looked up quietly. "My medication is in that bag. I would like to get it before the turbulence returns." Fiona crossed her arms. "Policy says that only essential items should be removed from overhead bins during flight. We will be starting our service soon. Please remain seated." Simone inhaled slowly. Her voice remained even. "I understand policy, but I also understand my rights as a passenger. The sign is off. I'm not asking for anything out of order." A few passengers glanced over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Fiona's tone sharpened. "Ma'am, if you cannot follow instructions, I may have to escalate this to the captain. We have procedures for a reason." Simone studied her face. She could sense that Fiona was testing her, waiting to see if she would push back. Just then, Lucille Kim leaned toward the aisle, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "I believe she only wants to get her medication dear. Surely, that is not an unreasonable request." Fiona blinked eyes, narrowing for a heartbeat before she smiled tightly. "I will retrieve it myself, then." She walked briskly to the back of the plane, returning with Simone's bag and setting it down on Simone's lap with an unnecessary thud. "Here you go, ma'am." Simone nodded her thanks, ignoring the pointed display. She unzipped her bag, took out her medication, and returned the bag to the floor at her feet. Fiona lingered a moment, as if searching for another reason to challenge her. Simone met her gaze unflinching. They held each other's stare until Fiona finally moved away. Daniel Brooks leaned in, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Simone smiled faintly. "I am used to it." She hated how true those words sounded in her own ears. She looked down at her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. She added another note, Flight 7146 attendant. Fiona Miles denied retrieval of medical bag until challenged by a fellow passenger stated policy, but allowed exceptions for others. Simone paused, then typed in all caps, "Pattern of selective enforcement." Across the aisle, Lucille caught Simone's eye. She gave a small smile of encouragement, as if to say, "You are not alone." The drink service resumed soon after. Sophie Tran stopping at Simone's row this time with more care. "What can I get you?" she asked. "Water, please. And thank you for your help," Simone replied. Sophie gave a tiny, grateful nod. As the cart moved on, Simone sat back, reflecting on the absurdity of having to negotiate for basic dignity. The policies were always just vague enough, always flexible, depending on who you were dealing with and what they thought of you. A sudden jolt of turbulence sent a ripple through the cabin. The captain's voice came on calm and commanding. "Folks, we will have to pause service and request everyone to buckle up for the next few minutes. Thank you for your cooperation." Simone fastened her belt. The movement gave her something to do, hands busy, mind racing. She thought about her years working in aviation, how many times she had seen regulations weaponized against people who looked like her. Not just passengers, but staff pilots, even executives' rules applied in the spirit of safety. For some, in the spirit of control. For others, she remembered a meeting months ago with the head of the Civil Aviation Administration Agency. They had talked about the invisible line between order and oppression, how easy it was to slip from one to the other, how often the line was crossed without anyone noticing except the ones who suffered it. Her internal struggle sharpened. Should she reveal who she was? Should she tell Fiona and the crew exactly what authority she had? Or would that only reinforce the narrative that black women needed to invoke power to get respect? Her phone buzzed again. A message from Rachel. "Quick update, Dad's feeling better. He wants to know if you are bringing home that ridiculous board game you always hated." Simone smiled despite herself, remembering Sunday afternoons filled with laughter and the kind of joy that could make you forget the world for a while. The turbulence passed. The seatbelt sign blinked off. As passengers relaxed again, Fiona resumed her walk through the cabin. Her eyes lingered on Simone's. "Row." She paused just long enough to send a silent message. Daniel whispered, "You do not have to take it. You know that, right?" Simone exhaled slowly. "I know," she said, "but sometimes you just want to get home." Lucille gave her another nod of solidarity. In that moment, Simone felt the burden ease just a little. It was the knowledge that someone else saw what she saw, that she was not imagining it. Still, her mind turned over the confrontation. What if she had not spoken up? What if Lucille had not intervened? How many times had she let something slide just to keep the peace? How many times had someone else been forced to fight alone? Simone looked down at her lap, then at the window. Beyond the glass, the sky stretched clear and endless. Sometimes it seemed like justice itself was as far away as the horizon. But Simone Avery had spent her career making sure the sky belonged to everyone, and she was not about to stop now. The clouds outside the window blurred into a sea of white as Skyline Air Flight 71446 pressed on toward Oak Ridge. Simone tried to ground herself in the rhythm of the plane. She closed her eyes, counting her breaths, picturing Rachel's kitchen and the smell of pancakes. She clung to these small comforts as armor. But the aftershocks from her exchange with Fiona Miles lingered. Each time Fiona passed Simone's row, she glanced at Simone with a challenge simmering in her eyes. It was as if the crew had marked her as trouble, simply for expecting to be treated like everyone else. Simone tried to focus on a crossword puzzle, but her mind kept spinning scenes from the morning. The gate agent's suspicion, the overhead bin refusal, the challenge over her medication. These memories replayed with growing clarity, and they were joined by 1,000 smaller moments from her life. Waiting on hold a little longer than everyone else. Being told to calm down when she dared to raise her voice. Emails left unanswered in board meetings, stares on the subway. This flight was just a condensed version of the World outside, Simone wondered if she had made things harder for herself. If she had simply smiled and apologized, would Fiona have moved on? Or would she always have been a target, no matter how gracious she was? She looked at Lucille Kim, whose knitting needles clacked softly. Lucille's presence was soothing. She had lived enough years to know when to speak and when silence was a weapon. Simone felt a surge of gratitude for her neighbor's quiet alliance. A new ache flared in Simone's head. She reached into her bag for her water bottle and fumbled the cap. The bottle rolled under Daniel Brooks's seat. Daniel bent and retrieved it with a kind smile. "Here you go. You look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders." Simone managed a tired laugh. "Only the weight of this cabin." Daniel leaned in a bit closer. His voice soft. "I'm sorry this is happening to you." "It is not your fault," Simone nodded. "But sometimes you wonder how many times you're supposed to just take it." A few rows ahead, a mother struggled with her toddler's tantrum. The child's cries rose above the drone of the engines. Fiona appeared instantly. Her tone was gentle, her smile sympathetic. She crouched down, offered a toy from her pocket, even patted the child's back reassuringly. The scene was like a commercial for kindness. Simone could not help but feel bitter. She wondered how it was so easy for Fiona to show patience to some and hostility to others. Was it just her? Was it the uniform? Was it the history written on Simone's skin? Just as she finished her water, Fiona appeared again. Her posture, rigid. "I'm going to have to ask you to keep your bag on the floor from now on." Simone blinked. "My bag is under my seat. That is where it is supposed to be." Fiona frowned. "You are blocking the aisle." Simone checked. The bag was entirely under her seat. She met Fiona's gaze, steady and unblinking. "I am following your rules. I'm asking for nothing but basic respect." Fiona straightened. "I will have to inform the captain if you continue to be uncooperative." Her voice was a quiet threat. Simone felt her hands trembling, but she made her voice as calm as possible. "Please do. That is your right as a crew member." Fiona hesitated as if she expected Simone to fold, then spun on her heel and walked toward the cockpit. The knot in Simone's chest tightened. She looked at Lucille, who gave her a nod of encouragement. Daniel glanced over, concern flickering in his eyes. Simone closed her eyes and tried to gather herself. Inside her, a war was raging. Shame, anger, exhaustion, and resolve fought for dominance. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted to fight. She wanted to get home and pretend this never happened. She wanted to demand the justice she had given to others for years. Her internal struggle reached a peak. Should she announce her identity? Should she remind Fiona and the crew of the real power she held? Or would that simply give them another reason to dismiss her as entitled? For a moment, Simone remembered her mother's funeral. Pastor had spoken about dignity, about carrying yourself with grace, even when the world tried to strip it away. Simone had promised herself she would never bow her head just to make someone else comfortable. The cockpit door opened. Captain Gary Dalton stepped out. He was a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and the easy confidence of a man who had spent half his life in the sky. His voice was deep and commanding. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking not at Simone but at Fiona. Fiona spoke first. Her tone was urgent and faintly theatrical. "This passenger has been argumentative since boarding. She refused to follow instructions about her luggage. Now she is being disruptive." Simone's heart pounded. She forced herself to meet the captain's gaze. She spoke quietly and clearly. "I have complied with every request. I have not raised my voice or left my seat." I'm simply asking to be treated like any other passenger." Captain Dalton's eyes narrowed. He turned back to Fiona. "I trust your judgment, Fiona." He looked at Simone. "I need you to cooperate fully for the remainder of the flight. Otherwise, I will have to involve airport security on landing." Simone took a deep breath. She felt anger threatening to spill over, but she controlled it as she always did. "I understand," she replied, "but I also have a right to expect fairness." The captain nodded briskly, then turned away. The exchange left the cabin tense and silent. Lucille patted Simone's arm quietly. Daniel stared at the floor. Simone stared out the window. Her heart hammered. She felt raw, exposed, but beneath the humiliation a spark of defiance caught. She was tired of being made to feel small. She pulled out her second phone, a black device with a secure government line. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. She was not ready yet, but a decision was forming with every beat of her heart. The game was no longer about compliance. It was about truth. The cabin seemed to pulse with silent electricity after Captain Gary Dalton's stern words. Simone sat still, her hands folded tightly together in her lap. She watched the rows ahead and behind, feeling dozens of eyes sneak glances her way. People whispered into their phones or leaned toward one another, but no one said anything aloud. Simone's mind raced with possibilities and regrets. Maybe she should have let Fiona win every argument. Maybe she should have put up with it just a little longer. But another part of her, the part that was always watching, always alert to subtle injustice, refused to back down. "Lucille," Kim reached over and gently placed her hand on Simone's arm. "You do not have to take this," she murmured. "You did nothing wrong." Simone gave a slight nod, grateful for Lucille's support, but she could feel a cold ache growing at the base of her spine. She wondered what Rachel would think if she saw her now. Would her sister have told her to stay silent or to fight for herself? A short while later, Fiona returned, her posture stiff. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line. "The captain would like a word with you at the front, ma'am," she said. Simone stood slowly, aware of every pair of eyes tracking her. She followed Fiona up the aisle, head held high. Inside the forward galley, Captain Dalton stood arms crossed. His face was closed off, his eyes steely and unreadable. Sophie Tran lingered nearby, her hands twisting nervously at her apron. "Ma'am, I want to be very clear." Dalton said, "We have procedures for a reason. My lead flight attendant tells me you have repeatedly failed to comply with instructions. I need to know if there's going to be any further disruption." Simone looked him in the eye. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Captain, I have complied with every reasonable request. I placed my bag where I was told. I sat quietly in my seat. I requested my medication. I have not raised my voice. I am not causing any disruption." Dalton's expression did not change. His authority was absolute in the air, and he knew it. "That is not what I have been told," he replied. "The safety and order of this flight is my responsibility. I do not tolerate interference with crew members. I trust my team. You will return to your seat, and there will be no more issues." "Are we clear?" Simone swallowed. She felt the urge to protest, to demand that he listen to her side. But she saw in his eyes that he had already decided he would always take his crew's word over hers. "We are clear," she said simply. He dismissed her with a nod. She turned and walked back down the aisle, passing passengers who quickly looked away as she met their eyes. Lucille waited for her as she returned to row 10. Well, she said, "What now?" Simone sat down, hands trembling, but her voice was calm. Now I make sure this does not happen to someone else." Daniel Brooks leaned in quietly. "Do you want to file a complaint when we land? I can back you up." "Thank you," Simone said. "I might just do that." She sat back and breathed deeply, letting the anger cool into something harder and more precise. She remembered all the people who had told her to keep her head down, who had warned her that raising her voice would only make things worse. She remembered the first time she had sat on a plane as a child, knees knocking with excitement and fear, dreaming of the world above the clouds. She had spent her whole life playing by the rules, but the rules kept changing depending on who was enforcing them. She opened her government phone, the black device she had hesitated to use before. Now, she typed a short message directly to the Civil Aviation Administration Agency's Internal Affairs Office, Flight 7146 in flight, discrimination escalation, by lead attendant and captain selective enforcement of policy requesting review on landing, full statement to follow. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision. Was she overreacting? Was this really the moment to draw a line? She looked at Lucille, at Daniel, at Sophie, whose eyes darted between her and the galley. She looked at the silent passengers around her, some of whom wore pitying looks, others merely uncomfortable. No, she thought, this is not just for me. The plane hummed on through clear air. The sky outside was infinite, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Lucille whispered, "You did the right thing." Simone nodded. This is what justice looks like, she thought. Not dramatic, not angry, just resolute. When Fiona passed again, she met Simone's gaze, and for the first time there was uncertainty in her eyes. In the galley, Captain Dalton and Fiona conferred in low voices. The crew believed the problem was managed, that authority had been reasserted. But they did not realize the wheels of real accountability were now turning far above their reach. Simone settled into her seat. She gazed out the window, her heart steady now. She had played by the rules, she had endured every slight without raising her voice, but she had also refused to be silenced. And now, as the clouds passed beneath her and Oak Ridge drew closer, she felt a quiet certainty. The next chapter would not be written by those who abused their power, but by those who had the courage to challenge it. Simone Avery sat quietly in her seat, letting the steady hum of the engines anchor her. The encounter with Captain Dalton still echoed in her mind. His face had been closed and unwavering, as if he were the judge and she the misbehaving child. She knew she should feel fear or shame, but instead she felt something different, something that had been building inside her for years. Quiet power. She watched the flight attendants as they resumed their duties. The mood in the cabin was changed. There was a tension just beneath the surface, a sense that something important had shifted. Fiona. Miles passed by, no longer projecting easy confidence. She stole a glance at Simone, then quickly looked away. Sophie Tran was careful and gentle as she poured coffee for passengers. Her hands shook just slightly, and her voice was soft as she asked Lucille Kim if she needed anything. "Thank you, dear," Lucille said kindly. "You are doing just fine." Daniel Brooks was silent. He watched Simone as if weighing whether to say something, but decided to give her space. She was grateful for it. Simone stared down at the government phone in her lap. She remembered her own words during countless training sessions. She had taught new agents that real authority was never loud or showy. It was precise and patient. She reviewed the message she had already sent to Internal Affairs, then composed another one. This time, it went directly to the Director of the Civil Aviation Administration Agency, Director Stone. "This is Dr. Simone Avery. Deputy Director on board Skyline Air 7146 experiencing ongoing discrimination and selective enforcement. By crew, Captain Gary Dalton is aware and has declined to intervene, requesting immediate intervention upon landing at Oak Ridge Airport. Crew should be held at the gate for debriefing. Further details to follow. She pressed send. The effect was immediate. Within minutes, her phone vibrated with confirmation. Agency's command center acknowledged receipt of her message and began coordinating with Oak Ridge ground officials. A quiet sense of calm settled over Simone. She had done her part. No yelling, no drama. No one else on the plane would know what she had triggered, but change was coming. Sophie approached with a tray. "Would you care for anything else, Dr. Avery?" Her voice was almost a whisper now, the words formal and careful. "No, thank you," Simone replied. She met Sophie's eyes with understanding. Sophie's shoulders relaxed as if a weight had been lifted. The flight continued. A gentle peace fell over the rows. Passengers seemed less tense now, sensing but not understanding that a balance of power had shifted. Daniel leaned over and spoke quietly. "Whatever happens next, you did the right thing, you know that," Simone nodded. "I hope it makes a difference." "Not just for me," Daniel smiled. "I think it already has," Lucille quietly added. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be shaken. The rest falls into place." For the first time that morning, Simone allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. The past few hours had been exhausting. Each exchange with Fiona, each silent battle at the gate, every policy used as a shield against fairness, all of it pressed down on her. Yet her heart felt lighter than it had in days. She dreamed of Oak Ridge and pancakes and her father's warm laughter. She remembered the small house where she and Rachel grew up, the creak of the kitchen floor, the scent of lilacs through the open window. She dreamed of the world as it could be and of dignity as something simple and unshakable. The captain's voice broke the reverie. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all bags are stowed beneath the seat in front of you." Simone's eyes opened. She looked out the window. The clouds below had broken into sunlight, revealing green fields and the neat squares of the Oak Ridge suburbs. Fiona came by for one last check. Her face was pale and uncertain. She lingered by Simone's seat for a moment as if wanting to say something, but only managed to strain, "Have a pleasant landing." "Thank you," Simone replied, and her tone was soft but firm. As the plane began its descent, the nervous chatter of the passengers grew louder. Sophie helped an elderly man retrieve his cane. Daniel closed his book. Lucille tucked away her knitting. Simone's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a direct message from the agency's ground liaison. "Dr. Avery, we are in position at Oak Ridge. The crew will be met at the gate. Please wait for our team before deplaning." She put her phone away. Her heart was steady. She felt a strange mix of anticipation and peace. The wheels she had set in motion were turning beyond her sight. When the plane touched down in Oak Ridge and rolled toward the gate, Simone looked up at the sun streaming through the window. She felt the gravity of her actions, but no regret. No part of her wished she had stayed silent as the plane braked to a stop and the chime sounded to unbuckle. Simone waited in her seat. The world outside looked new. She could hear her father's voice again, reminding her that dignity was not given by others but claimed by the self. And now Simone Avery was ready to claim it for herself and for those who would come after the cabin doors of Skyline Air Flight 7146 opened with a familiar mechanical sigh. The morning sun spilled into the plane, casting long lines of light across the carpeted aisle. Simone Avery remained seated as the crowd began to stir. Daniel Brooks gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out into the flow of passengers outside the window. Simone watched airport vehicles gliding over the tarmac and the unmistakable figures of airport security and uniformed officials gathering just beyond the jet bridge. She felt her heartbeat quicken, but her hands were steady. She had been through bigger storms than this, and she would not falter now. Passengers filed past carrying bags and sharing fragments of conversation. Some glanced at Simone, curiosity written on their faces. They could sense something was different about this arrival, but few understood its meaning. Lucille. Kim paused by Simone's seat. She placed a gentle hand on Simone's shoulder and whispered, "I am proud of you, my dear. Do not let anyone tell you that your voice does not matter." Simone smiled, her eyes bright. "Thank you, Lucille. I will not forget your kindness." After the last passenger left, Sophie Tran stood by the galley, nervously adjusting her name tag. Her eyes met Simone's, and she gave a tiny, grateful nod. Captain Gary Dalton and Fiona Miles were at the front of the cabin, their posture stiff and forced. Fiona clutched her clipboard, white-knuckled, while Dalton spoke quietly with a ground official just outside the door. As Simone stepped into the jet bridge, two men in dark suits and a woman in a navy blue dress stood waiting. Their professional calm was unmistakable. They introduced themselves as part of the Civil Aviation Administration Agency's ground response team. The leader, a woman named Agent Wallace, greeted Simone with quiet respect. "Dr. Avery, we are here at your request. We would like to take your statement as well as statements from the crew and any willing passengers." Simone nodded. "I'm ready. Thank you for responding so quickly." They guided her into a quiet waiting room near the gate. Within moments, she was joined by Lucille Kim, who volunteered to give a statement, and Daniel Brooks, who quietly offered his account of what had happened. Sophie Tran also arrived, her face pale but determined. While Simone spoke with Agent Wallace and her colleagues, more officials entered the plane to speak with Captain Dalton and Fiona Miles. The crew's surprise was obvious. Dalton blustered at first, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. Fiona protested that she had simply followed procedure, but as the investigators calmly requested logbooks, reports, and written explanations, the air of control began to slip from the crew. Sophie was the first to break her silence. She spoke with Agent Wallace, her voice shaking but clear. She described everything the way Fiona had refused Simone access to her bag. The condescending language at the overhead bin, the selective enforcement of rules. Sophie admitted that she had felt uncomfortable but afraid to challenge her senior. "That is no excuse," she whispered. "But I want to do what is right now." Daniel gave his statement describing how he had seen the difference in tone and treatment, how the same rules were not applied equally. He spoke about the tension in the cabin, the way passengers seemed to shrink from conflict. Lucille offered her account with the steady assurance of a teacher. She described the exchanges between Simone and the crew, the small humiliations she had witnessed, and the courage it took to remain calm. When it was Simone's turn, she spoke clearly and without anger. She described each moment, from the gate agent's suspicion in Summit City to Fiona's actions on board to the final confrontation with Captain Dalton. She did not embellish or dramatize. She let the truth stand on its own. Agent Wallace listened attentively, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. "Thank you, Dr. Avery. You have handled this with admirable restraint and professionalism." Simone nodded quietly. "I'm only sorry it had to come to this." She felt the ache in her chest again, the sadness that even after all her years in aviation, she was still forced to fight for basic dignity. Outside the waiting room, officials finished speaking with the crew. Captain Dalton's confidence seemed to drain away with every question. Fiona Miles stared blankly at the floor, clutching her clipboard. Sophie waited nearby, anxious but relieved. A supervisor from Skyline Air arrived, a short man named Mr. Riley. His face was pale as he apologized to Simone and the others, Dr. Avery, on behalf of Skyline Air. I want to assure you we take these matters very seriously. We will fully cooperate. With the investigation, Simone thanked him politely, but inside she knew that words would not be enough. Change never came easily to institutions, not unless someone forced it. When the interviews ended, Agent Wallace told Simone, "The crew will not be released to their next assignment. We are beginning a formal inquiry. There will be follow-up with all witnesses and with your office." "Thank you," Simone said quietly. "I hope this is the start of something better." As she stepped back into the public side of the terminal, Rachel Avery was waiting with open arms. Her face glowed with relief and joy. Simone fell into her sister's embrace, letting herself finally exhale. "I am so glad you are home," Rachel whispered. "Dad is waiting for you. There are pancakes in the car." Simone laughed through her tears. Home had never felt so precious. They left the airport together, Lucille Kim waving goodbye from a distance, Daniel Brooks offering a final nod of solidarity. Sophie Tran, standing near the gate, shoulders a little straighter than before. Outside, the world was bright and full of promise. Simone let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the last time she had to fight such a battle. But even if it was not, she knew now that she would never fight alone. The next 48 hours in Oak Ridge moved in a blur. Simone Avery found herself caught between the simple pleasures of home and the storm that had followed her from the sky. She spent the mornings at her father's side, watching him sleep in the hospital, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the machines. Rachel brought her coffee and news from the outside world, their quiet moments punctuated by laughter that felt like medicine. But even as Simone held her father's hand, her mind could not escape the events of Flight 7146. The agency called several times each day, requesting clarifications, more details, and statements. She answered every call with calm professionalism, though the effort left her drained. Each retelling made the moments on the plane feel both closer and further away. Meanwhile, the investigation into Skyline Air unfolded with quiet speed. Agent Wallace and her team pulled passenger lists and reviewed surveillance footage from Summit City International. The video from the gate told a damning story. Owen Price, the gate agent, was seen questioning Simone's bag while waving through a white businessman whose carry-on was much larger. There was no sign of policy being applied evenly. At Oak Ridge Airport, the agency collected statements from other passengers and staff. The accounts were consistent. People described a pattern of selective enforcement, subtle humiliation, and the kind of quiet hostility that was easy to miss unless you knew to look for it. Sophie Tran's testimony was especially powerful. She described how she felt pressured to support Fiona Miles even when she knew it was wrong. "I was afraid to lose my job," Sophie admitted, "but I could not keep pretending that nothing was happening." Lucille Kim's statement was a turning point. Her calm, clear account gave the investigators exactly what they needed: an outside perspective from someone who had nothing to gain or lose. She explained how she watched each exchange, how she had seen kindness for some passengers and coldness for others. As the evidence piled up, The agency's investigators began to see a pattern. The records for Fiona Miles were not clean. There had been several complaints over the years, all quietly closed or brushed aside. The logbooks revealed a culture of looking the other way as long as flights arrived on time and no one made too much noise. Captain Gary Dalton's record was spotless, but only on paper. He had never been disciplined, but interviews with other crew members revealed that he almost always sided with his senior staff. Rarely listening to complaints from passengers, especially those he considered disruptive, Simone kept in touch with Agent Wallace, who provided updates with the professionalism Simone appreciated. The agency is preparing a preliminary report, Agent Wallace said on one call. Skyline Air will be required to attend a hearing, and the crew will be temporarily suspended. We have enough evidence to move forward with disciplinary action. Simone felt a mix of relief and sadness. The battle was being fought with facts and policy now, not just with feelings and memory. She thought about Fiona Miles and Captain Dalton and wondered whether they felt regret or only fear at being caught. In the days leading up to the hearing, Skyline Air's legal team contacted Simone and the other key witnesses. Their tone was apologetic. They asked her to reconsider pressing the issue, promising new training programs and a public statement. But Simone stood firm. The time for empty promises had passed. Her internal struggle sharpened in these quiet hours alone at home. Should she accept the apology and let it go? Was it really worth all this trouble? Part of her wanted nothing more than to disappear into her family's embrace, to let the world move on. But then she thought of Rachel, of Lucille, of Sophie and Daniel. She thought of all the passengers on every flight who might never know their rights had been defended by a stranger. One night, she sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the trees. Rachel joined her, wrapping a blanket around Simone's shoulders. "You did the right thing," Rachel said softly. "Even if it is hard now, it will help someone else later." Simone squeezed her sister's hand. "I hope so. Sometimes it feels like nothing ever really changes." Rachel smiled. "But it does. You changed it," and the days that followed the story began to leak into the news. Local papers ran headlines about discrimination on Skyline Air and the agency's investigation. Social media picked up the story, fueled by the testimony of witnesses and the quiet strength of Dr. Simone Avery. The hashtag #FlyWithDignity began to trend. Passengers and airline staff from across the country shared their own experiences, echoing Simone's call for accountability. Meanwhile, the agency prepared for a formal hearing. The investigation had revealed more than a single incident. It had uncovered a culture of selective enforcement and hidden bias within Skyline Air's customer service. Simone was called to testify along with Lucille Kim, Sophie Tran, and Daniel Brooks. The airline's executives faced questions not just about the flight, but about the patterns of complaints buried in their files. On the morning of the hearing, Simone stood in front of a mirror, adjusting her suit. Her father's condition was stable enough that she felt comfortable leaving for a few hours. Rachel handed her a packed lunch and a note from their dad written in his shaky but determined script. "Remember who you are, and do not let anyone take your voice." At the courthouse, Simone walked through a crowd of reporters but kept her head high. The hearing room was bright and cold, filled with officials, lawyers, and members of the public. She found comfort in Lucille's calm presence, and in Sophie's quiet resolve. Daniel sat in the back, ready to support Agent Wallace presented the agency's findings. The evidence was clear and overwhelming. Simone answered questions with clarity and compassion. She refused to let anger overshadow the facts. When Fiona Miles was called to speak, her voice trembled. She admitted to applying rules unevenly and to acting out of habit rather than fairness. Captain Dalton defended his decisions, but the panel was unmoved. By the end of the day, Skyline Air's representatives promised to overhaul their training and force stricter oversight and apologize publicly to the affected passengers. The agency suspended Fiona Miles and Captain Dalton. Pending further review, Owen Price was terminated from his position at Summit City. As Simone left the courthouse, she felt the first true sense of relief since boarding that flight. Days of tension, grief, and uncertainty began to lift. The battle was not over, but it had shifted toward hope. She walked out into the sunlight, her shoulders squared, her heart lightened by the knowledge that her voice had changed more than just her own story. It had changed the sky itself for everyone who followed. The aftermath of the hearing sent ripples far beyond Oak Ridge. For days after the proceedings, the local and national news covered every update in the Skyline Air discrimination case. Simone Avery's name appeared in print and on television, but always as a symbol, not a celebrity. Reporters marveled at her composure while civil rights advocates praised her for shining a light on the subtle ways injustice persisted in modern travel. The public apology from Skyline Air's CEO came quickly. A letter appeared on the airline's website addressed to Dr. Simone Avery and all passengers affected by the incident. The company promised an immediate review of all its policies and the implementation of a new transparency system. Passengers would now be able to track complaints directly with an independent board monitored by the Civil Aviation Administration agency. But the consequences for those most directly involved were personal and lasting. Fiona Miles was terminated. Her departure was quiet, but those who knew her saw the difference. She no longer walked with the confidence that had once made her a fixture of the cabin crew. Her uniform stayed packed in a closet, her days marked by regret and a quiet bitterness. Sophie Tran heard from a friend that Fiona had moved away from Summit City and taken a job far from the skies she once called home. Owen Price, the gate agent, was also gone. His career in aviation was over before it had truly begun. The investigation revealed a pattern of profiling and subtle discrimination in his short tenure. When local papers tried to contact him for comment, he declined. He had learned the hardest way that small abuses of power do not go unnoticed forever. Captain Gary Dalton was suspended for a year with the possibility of returning to work only after completing comprehensive retraining and a review of his conduct. The humiliation of the hearing and the press coverage followed him home. Friends in the airline industry kept their distance, unsure whether he would ever regain the trust and authority he once held. For Sophie Tran, the story was different. The investigation found that her willingness to testify and her honesty in describing what she had seen made her an unexpected hero within Skyline Air. After the hearing, Sophie was invited to help design the new diversity and inclusion training required for all cabin crew. She accepted the offer, determined to turn her fear and guilt into something positive. Lucille Kim returned to her quiet life in Oak Ridge, but she received dozens of letters from strangers thanking her for standing up and speaking the truth. Her church community honored her at a Sunday service. Lucille told them, "I only did what I hoped someone would do for my own grandchildren." For Simone Avery, life began to return to its rhythms. Her father grew stronger each day, buoyed by the presence of his daughters and by the stories he heard about Simone's fight for justice. One evening, as he sat in the garden with Simone and Rachel, he squeezed her hand. "I am proud of you," he whispered. You did not let them shrink you down to nothing." Simone smiled, feeling a weight lift that had pressed on her for years. She realized that her strength was not just in her role or her authority, but in her ability to endure and insist on dignity for herself and for others. But there were moments of doubt as well. Simone wondered if she had changed enough, if the ripples from Flight 7146 would continue to spread. What about the people she would never meet, whose flights might still be shadowed by quiet discrimination? Would the new policies truly hold airline staff accountable, or would they fade over time? She called Agent Wallace one afternoon to ask about the progress of the new oversight program. The agent's voice was reassuring. "The new complaint system is already live, and we have seen an increase in passengers feeling comfortable reporting problems. The culture will take time to change, Dr. Avery, but this is a powerful first step." In the months that followed, Simone was invited to speak at aviation conferences and workshops. She was interviewed by student groups and advocacy organizations. Everyone wanted to know how she had found the courage to stand up in the face of authority and to pursue justice without anger. She always gave the same answer. It was not about courage, she told them. It was about refusing to accept what should never have been normal. It was about looking in the mirror and being able to say, "I did not stay silent." Rachel watched her sister blossom through the process. The old sense of exhaustion in Simone's eyes began to fade, replaced by a steadiness Rachel had not seen in years. Sometimes they would sit on the porch late at night talking about their mother, about the small ways dignity was built and rebuilt every day. Meanwhile, the world continued. To move forward, passengers on Skyline Air flights noticed a difference. Flight attendants were more attentive, gate agents smiled more and explained policies. Instead of simply barking orders, Simone would sometimes check the news on her phone and feel a quiet satisfaction. The change was small but real. One day Daniel Brooks called her. He had read about the new policies and wanted to thank Simone again for letting him be part of the process. "I hope you know you made a difference." He said, "My nephew is flying next week, and I know he will have a better experience because of you." Simone thanked him, grateful for his support. They talked for a long time about what it meant to carry the weight of other people's expectations and the ways small acts of resistance could shape the world. The echoes of Flight 7146 were still felt months later, but now they carried a different energy. Instead of anger or shame, they brought a sense of possibility. The struggle had been hard and costly, but it had not been wasted. As summer turned to autumn, Simone stood in her father's garden, watching the light shift through the leaves. She thought about what justice really meant, about how every small victory was part of something bigger. She was not the only one fighting, but she had become part of a wave, and she knew that wave would keep rolling long after her story faded from the headlines. A year had passed since Skyline Air Flight 7146 touched down in Oak Ridge and left its mark on more than just the aviation world for Dr. Simone. Avery, life had settled into a quieter rhythm, but the legacy of that day followed her everywhere. It seemed not as a burden, but as a gentle reminder of what it means to hold on to dignity in the face of adversity. At the Civil Aviation Administration Agency, Simone now led the new Passenger Dignity and Equity Task Force. She had thrown herself into the work helping to design policies and trainings that would become mandatory for all major U.S. airlines. The Fly with Dignity initiative was now a reality, thanks in large part to the testimony and courage of Simone and those who stood beside her. Every week, Simone received emails from travelers and airline staff sharing stories about their experiences. Sometimes they thanked her for helping create change. Sometimes they simply needed someone to listen to their pain. Simone read every message, careful not to let her heart become numb to the struggle. She replied with words of encouragement, advice, or simply solidarity. Her relationship with Rachel grew deeper and more joyful. Their father, now stronger, spent weekends tending his garden with his daughters. When he looked at Simone, he saw not only his child but a woman who had changed the rules of the world in her quiet way. Sophie Tran thrived in her new role as a diversity trainer for Skyline Air. She wrote curriculum, held workshops, and became a trusted mentor for new crew members. Sophie sometimes called Simone after a difficult day, and together they would reflect on how to help others find their own voice. Sophie had found purpose in the very place where she once felt afraid. Lucille Kim kept in touch with Simone, sending handwritten letters filled with stories of Oak Ridge, her church community, and the little victories she saw each day in the world around her. Sometimes Lucille would recall the long flight and express how proud she was to have witnessed justice in motion. Daniel Brooks, too, remained a friend, sending photos of his nephew's first solo trip across the country. The boy's face was bright with excitement, no trace of fear. The world was not perfect, but it was just a bit kinder. Simone was invited to speak at a national conference on equity in transportation. He stood at the podium looking out at an audience of policymakers, industry leaders, and advocates. Her voice was steady as she described not just the facts of Flight 7146, but the deeper truth behind every moment of the journey. She told the story of waiting at the gate, of overhearing casual dismissals, of being forced to comply with rules no one else was made to follow. She spoke of Lucille's quiet courage, of Daniel's solidarity, of Sophie's decision to speak up in spite of fear. Most of all, Simone talked about the importance of systems of accountability. She reminded the audience that progress was not about punishing a few bad actors, but about changing the invisible habits of entire organizations so that dignity became the norm, not the exception. She ended her speech with a simple message. Change is not about grand gestures. It is about refusing to let anyone decide who is worthy of respect and who is not. It is about the small acts of courage that add up over time until even the highest sky feels within reach. The room gave her a standing ovation. Afterwards, people approached her to say how her story had changed the way they thought about their work. A young flight attendant hugged Simone with tears in her eyes, saying, "I used to be afraid to speak up. Now I know it is not just allowed, it is necessary." In the months that followed, airlines across the country began to adopt similar dignity policies. The agency launched an anonymous reporting tool that made it easier for passengers and staff to hold airlines accountable. Social media was filled with stories from people who refused to be silent, thanks in part to the example set by Simone and her fellow travelers. Rachel organized a small celebration for the anniversary of the hearing friend's family, and even Lucille and Sophie gathered in the Avery backyard. There was music, laughter, and plates piled high with pancakes and strawberries. Simone's father raised a glass and toasted to those who dare to speak the truth. Late that evening, as the stars came out, Simone sat quietly beneath an old oak tree. She looked up at the sky, remembering all the years she had watched planes cut silver lines across the blue. Always wondering if things would ever change, she thought of that flight not as a story of anger or punishment, but as a lesson in the power of persistence and hope. The sky belonged to everyone it always had, but sometimes it needed someone to remind the world of that promise. Simone checked her phone one last time before heading inside. There were new messages waiting, stories of small victories and new beginnings. She smiled, knowing that the legacy of Flight 7146 was not hers alone. It belonged to every person who refused to let their voice be stilled. As she walked inside, her family's laughter echoing in the night, Simone felt at peace. She was no longer defined by a single flight or a single fight. She was part of a new story, one still being written by countless hands and countless skies. As the story of Dr. Simone Avery comes to a close, we are left with a powerful mix of emotions, admiration for her courage, tenderness for every quiet ally, and a burning outrage against the everyday acts of prejudice that still shadow our skies. Her fight was never about vengeance, but about the simple right to dignity, something that should never be denied to anyone, anywhere. Let this story be a reminder that even the smallest act of empathy can change a life, and that silence in the face of injustice is never truly neutral. Each time we look away, the cycle continues. But when we speak up, when we insist on fairness for all, we help build a world where every journey is safe, every passenger respected, and every flight a vessel of hope. What will you do the next time you witness someone being treated unfairly? Will you be a silent bystander or a quiet force for justice? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories. Together, we can turn empathy into action and make the world, and our skies, a little more just for everyone. See you in the next story.